This is Rough Drafts Welcome.
The podcast where you can mess up, and we can too.
I'm Sachiko.
And I'm Erin.
And together with the editors at Salt and Sage Books,
we're changing the face of storytelling, one rough draft at a time.
We're glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of Rough Drafts Welcome. This is part 2 of a continued conversation with Amy Bowen about the intersection between mental health and creativity. If you missed part 1, you can go back and listen to the episode just before this, and we're going to dive right back in to where we left off. Can you talk a little bit about scrupulosity? It's a term I've only learned recently, and it's kind of been blowing my mind.
Sure. So you can see this outside of OCD, but traditionally, like if we were talking about this in a diagnostic sense, is one of the categories underneath OCD that you can experience. So, for example, in OCD, you could have a group of aggressive obsessions. That would mean predominantly like I'm worried about hurting other people all the time, or I'm worried I might hurt myself. And that's coming from a very intrusive, repetitive kind of way. And to reduce that distress, I'm going to do some compulsions. With scrupulosity in particular, that would be one of the categories that we have under OCD. There's going to be a certain set of rules for the way that things must be done. And this can cross over in a variety of areas. Religious scrupulosity is one of
That's
the very
where I
common
first heard
ones.
of it. I heard of it first in the context of religious scrupulosity.
Yeah. And it's essentially a way to, usually with OCD in general, it comes from a need to control as much as I can around me due to my own feelings of not being able to be in control and the belief that I should be. And so with scrupulosity, it's generally this idea that there is a formula that I can complete. And if I do that formula well enough, then I am ensured this particular outcome. So for a lot of religious communities, this means, if I'm attending church every week, if I am doing the kind of study that I'm supposed to be doing every day, if I'm living a life where I'm serving other people, then I am guaranteed the outcome of being successful or being able to get into heaven at least, right? That one's a little bit farther away. But there's kind of this idea that I should be able to control some aspects of my life as long as I'm doing good enough. With OCD and scrupulosity in OCD, this can become amplified where every day you are just having run through your mind intrusively and repetitively all of these things that you're supposed to be doing them and how you're supposed to be doing them. And that if you do not do it in that particular way, something very bad will happen and it will be your fault. And so you have to compulsively do all of the things on your list. And if you do not, then you're going to feel that anxiety rise and rise and rise. And with OCD generally, the more you do the compulsion, it reinforces the belief as a whole. So you see it usually the pattern between the obsessive or intrusive thought or feeling coming up and then the compulsive behavior getting tighter and tighter and tighter the longer that you do it. And the treatment is exposures to not doing the compulsion. And that can be very, very distressing when it really does feel like it's going to be your fault that this horrible thing is going to happen because you didn't do it right.
Right.
When we're looking at it, well, I guess first I should check in because I'm speaking from a clinical perspective. Does that make sense? Do you have questions about
No, that I'm tracking with you. I'm just seeing as you're talking, I'm thinking about the ways that, and I'm not trying to say that anybody who I know personally has OCD, but this idea that like there is one correct way to do it. And that if I don't do it in this one particular way, something bad will happen. Or the way I see it framed often in the writing community is that the good thing won't happen, which is the bad thing. But that idea that like we are somehow in control of the outcome of our creative life, I think is a really, really pervasive one.
Yes. And again, that's steeped in privilege.
Yeah.
But I think at the core of it, we're not saying that you don't have some control, right? But there's that balancing point where we have influence. we have influence over how things go, but we don't have control. None of us ever have control. I mean, if you feel like you do, then there may be some surrender work that would be helpful. Because it's just a matter of time until something happens that shows you that you're not. And living in that space of control really creates a lot of anxiety, because anytime you're trying to control something that really you don't have control over, it's gonna make you anxious.
Yeah, for sure. How do you, how you as an artist, like, how do you work through that? How do you hit this point where you're like, I am just going to surrender and make my stuff anyway? Like, how do you deal with that, the anxiety of it, that maybe this isn't going to turn into anything. Maybe it's not, maybe it's worthless, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could probably talk for a whole podcast about that. I think generally it is not easy, because it has ripples into so many different things, right? There are so many areas that it impacts. It impacts our beliefs about money. It impacts our beliefs about what kind of careers we should be allowed to have. It impacts how hard we feel like we have to work every day. It impacts our gender roles and how we do that with families. And so I think it is a very complicated question, because it's really just asking, how am I allowed to, in a world with all of these rules, still be myself?
Yeah.
And that's a very complicated answer. I think that the primary thing I would say is we're really coming back down to, do I know who I am? Can I connect with what I actually like and what makes me feel good? And then what are the barriers for me to be able to do that? And that might be systemic barriers. That might be belief barriers. That might be lack of accommodations, right? There's a lot of different things that need to be worked through or processed. And sometimes we can't work through all of those things.
Yeah.
But that's my not so great answer.
No, I think it's a great answer. It makes me want to dive a little bit deeper into that. And I think you're right, though. I don't know that we have time in this particular conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm thinking about creativity as a healing practice. So I'm reading a book right now called Dissociation Made Simple. It's a really incredible book. I would highly recommend it if you've ever had questions about dissociation or honestly anything. It's such a good book, and it's told from the voices of people who have dissociative diagnoses or have dissociative systems. So I found it's a little bit clinical in parts, because the author does focus on research. You understand the scientific background of what's happening, but then she also made quite a lot of effort to be sure that she was including voices of people who live with dissociation and dissociative identities. But the chapter that I just finished listening to, she was talking about creative arts as healing practices. And I think it's really easy. I don't know if the same is true for visual arts. I'm curious if you feel like it is. In writing, I feel like there is an immense amount of industry pressure and social pressure as well for you to create something that is saleable, to somehow commodify the things that you are doing. I'm curious what your take is about how do you approach, I'm doing this thing because it is a healing practice for me, or because it helps me to connect to myself, or because it helps me know who I am, or because it feels good to me to write. But then how do you deal with that? And then also this capitalistic pressure to sell what you have made.
Yeah.
That's
a really big question too. I think it's kind of similar to maybe my answer to the last one, where there's a lot of our own internal scripting and beliefs that puts limitations around how we're supposed to behave and what we're supposed to do and what's allowed.
Mm-hmm. Can I pause you for a second? Would you define scripting?
Yeah, so I guess the way that I was viewing it is kind of like the set of rules. It's the, leave it to Beaver mom, right? That so many women have felt the need to script and pattern their lives after that way of being as the correct way of being.
Mm.
Um,
Is it similar to like the misbeliefs that we have, or the rules that we run our life by?
yeah,
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah. So like the subconscious beliefs of being a woman looks like XYZ, being a mother looks like XYZ. I
Right.
can't
Yeah.
have this because of this particular rule.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I understand. Thank you.
And I think that this is actually, it comes up a lot for men in the creative industry, especially with art, where if you think back into the 1800s and 1700s, the way that women were expected to be, the arts was a woman's field to be in, not necessarily writing. But if you're looking at more visual art,
well, like the whole,
women
I mean,
and
just think of like
music.
the Jane Austen, right? Oh, she can play the piano, she can embroider, she can paint, she's
Right.
refined.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that that can come up quite often for men, where the only way to be a man and to meet society's expectations is to be an engineer or be a businessman or go into construction, something that you're obviously, going to work with a hammer in your pocket or a briefcase in your hand. And if you're not doing that, if you are an artist, or if you do want to get involved with music or you do want to dance, then you're somehow less of a man. So I definitely see when it comes to art in particular, that can be very difficult for people who are assigned male at birth generally, right? Where there is just not a lot of room to be able to express yourself in ways that we have deemed as a culture to be more feminine.
There's a lot of homophobia that happens in that intersection as well.
Yes, exactly. So I think in terms of the question, the first step would probably be giving yourself room to question, giving yourself room to really critically think about things instead of just accepting, from the outset that this is how things are going to be and that I don't have a choice. And then that allows us to kind of expand our worldview, to look outside of our own particular families or religious influence or culture or whatever, because there is diversity in those things that we can create more of what it is that we'd like. But we don't have that option if we're still in that very black and white way of thinking that there is no alternative. So I'd say that's probably the first step.
I'm feeling like there's so many different ways that we could go from here, and I'm not sure which path I want to take. Do you have anything that you would particularly like to talk about, or should I eeny, meeny, miny, mo my question?
I think if we're kind of coming back to how this would apply to my services in Salt and Sage, as a sensitivity reader, and for authors who might be wanting to write with sensitivity around these kind of mental health issues, I would definitely want to see more representation of the full experience, right? That if someone is a character in your story that has a mental health condition, are you showing all aspects of that? Or are you using it as a way to kind of romanticize the character? Or are you using it as a way to just show, like, well, maybe they were really awkward, but they also were brilliant in this way, without showing the negative impacts? Just really making sure that you are viewing the whole person and not the mental health condition as if that is their entire personality, and not from that lens of just capitalism, like really being able to do some of your own work processing any of those beliefs that you might have over what does disabled actually mean, what does what are the implications really of mental health, instead of using it as a prop or a tool to just give your character something like extra that makes them different or interesting.
Yes. It's reminding me of, I mean, stereotypes are problematic for this exact reason, that they are used as shortcuts to indicate something. And they can be harmful. I mean, they almost are always harmful simply because they are one-dimensional. I'm thinking of a book that I read called Have Geek, like Geek. Geek. Yeah, those were the right words for the right letters. It sounded weird coming out of my mouth for some reason. Have Geek Will Travel by Rebecca Blevins. She's actually a sensitivity reader at Salt and Sage, but she wrote this book. I read it and I was so deeply touched by the representation of her autistic character, who is the main love interest. It's a rom-com. It's so cute. It's Lord of the Rings nerdy, and it's set mostly in New Zealand. And it just 10 out of 10. It is such a sweet and just lovely book. But she talks about this character's talents and skills, and he's a cool guy. And one of the things that she also was very intentional, because I talked to her about it afterwards. She was like, yeah, I did that very much on purpose, was that she included him having a meltdown. Yeah. And she talks about, from his point of view, she discusses like what it feels like to go to, I think it was a specific Lord of the Rings thing. Like he's going on this big tour through New Zealand to see all of the different things. And even though he's wanted to go and see this thing for so long, actually being there was really overstimulating. And so then later that evening when they're having like a romantic moment and you're like, oh, maybe. And then he is, it's too much and he gets really overstimulated and he has a meltdown. And the incredibly compassionate way that the love interest, that the woman in the book is able to like sit with him in that, the whole time I was reading, I was just like, I have never seen anything like this before. I've seen people use autistic meltdowns as like oh no, now they've had this miscommunication and they'll never be able to get together now, like as a shortcut, right? Or I've seen them use it as like oh, he's mentally unstable, or he's emotionally unstable, or he's whatever it happens to be. But in this one, the approach to it was just so humane that it really struck me that we don't see very much of that.
Right. It's very common to use something like a meltdown in the context of what you would otherwise do in a book in that situation, which is create some kind of conflict.
Yeah.
Right. But instead of having the conflict be something that is arising from both people and their perceptions and communication and what's hopefully building on your whole character arc, right?
Yeah.
It just becomes that the conflict is the person with the mental health condition and them just like behaving how they would in that experience, which I think is really it's very flawed. And
then we talked about this in our last conversation, but this idea that like you can just magically find somebody who can fix you.
Right.
And like, no, autistic meltdowns are going to happen no matter who you're married to or who you're dating or who you're with. Right. They're going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. When it comes to showing like creativity in this, I would also really encourage authors to be mindful about if they are really understanding the implications, right? So this is one that comes up like if you have seen the representation of schizophrenia that is in A Beautiful Mind. Where he is this very brilliant mathematician, but when he's on his medication, he cannot function, which obviously some of that has to do with the time, right? We've come a long way in terms of psychopharmacology and just generally what is available with fewer side effects.
And knowing too that like these are the side effects and we can try a different medication and
there's a lot more things available now that wasn't back then. But there is a danger in creating a character whose almost their sole personality is just based around whatever their diagnosis is, right? And that if you treat that diagnosis, they are basically no longer a person. Instead of it really being viewed as, like, oh, maybe this medication is not the correct medication, right?
Yes.
Because I see that a lot in books, that there is still that stigma around medication generally. And that is a stigma I would just love to see just die.
Me too.
Because
It's so evangelical.
yes,
I feel angry whenever I run across it.
yes. So I would definitely make sure if you are using, if you're talking about mental health in a setting in your book that it has present day medications available, right? That you are doing your research about that and trying to not perpetuate stigma around it being a harmful thing overall.
You
Certainly,
feel
there
like
can be harmful impacts, but again, that would be an issue related to we need more research around how does someone's particular genetic structure or how their body is metabolizing a particular medication. Like that is an area where we need more research, where we're still able to view the brain as an organ, like a heart or a lung or something else that can function in a way that we don't anticipate, and that we can respond to an organ in your body with medication to help your life improve. And that doesn't have to be like some kind of a sign of weakness or that you're not trying hard enough.
yes. Oh, goodness me. Yeah, the whole sign of weakness thing, that feels really frustrating to me. Okay, I wanted to talk about 10 more minutes. I'm curious. Let's imagine. Say that someone were to come to you as a friend or maybe even as a therapist, if you're comfortable going that route, and they were to say, let's just use me as an example, I guess. Say that this person comes to you and they have ADHD and they're like, I really want to write, but I feel like I can't, or that it's hard, or like I can't do it well enough. And I know there's a ton of nuance that's going to go in here, but like, what would be your starting place for someone who's listening, who's like, I want to write, but like my mental health makes it really difficult for me to do that in a way that I want to do that? Well, where do we begin with that?
For someone, if we're looking at different neurotype, like particularly with ADHD, the first thing that I always look at is going to be the easiest thing to change, which, I mean, there's an asterisk on easy, right? Because I understand it's not all the time. But for me, that would be looking at sensory stuff. So it's quite frequent when you are hyper-focused or working on a thing that you can kind of dissociate out, or just be like more on the hyposensitive side on sensory areas where you may not notice that your body is feeling a particular way.
Right.
So for me, that would be looking at if you are writing in particular, and that's the thing that we want to do. Where are you writing? Are you writing in a room that has overhead lighting that's buzzing in the background that maybe you're not noticing? Are you giving yourself an expectation that when you're writing, you should do so without any music in the background? Or on the other side, that you should be able to do it with lots of noise? And in those situations, we're looking at some pretty simple accommodations, like being able to use lamp lighting where you are in the room instead, or being able to wear noise canceling headphones, or giving yourself permission to have some noise in the background so that little extra energy part in your brain has somewhere to go. I would also consider what are kind of the ergonomics of where you're sitting. Are you kind of hyperextending your legs in the way that you're sitting the whole time that you are writing without realizing that that's what you're doing? Or are you forgetting to eat while you are doing it and then starting to get headaches every time that you're looking at the screen? Right. That would be the first place that I would start, is really evaluating, are you in an environment that is going to help you sensory wise? Because usually the body sensations and the body needs are going to overcrowd and push out any of that creativity, play, expressiveness, because the body's going to be like, hello, like I cannot keep sitting like this forever. Do you know, like I'm going to get a UTI if you don't go to the bathroom right now. And so if we're focusing on like beliefs or maybe expectations that you have for yourself or boundaries with other people. Like you could do all those things, but if your sensory environment is still not working for you, you could still have a lot of problems and feel confused about why you do. So that would definitely be the starting point. So we get to actually see what your sensory environment is looking like when you are expecting yourself to be able to function at the ways that you want to. So sensory wise, when do you feel the most awake and alert during the day? Those kinds of things would be the first place that I would look at.
That's such an interesting place to start. I think it's a very smart place to start because, I mean, just speaking as someone who has ADHD and my spouse has ADHD and my children have ADHD, we are an ADHD household. But the way that we all tend to forget that we exist inside of bodies is something that I did not fully understand was part of ADHD until I had been diagnosed. Before it was just for me like, okay, well, it said the clock says noon, so that means it's time to eat. And I wasn't really tuned into my own hunger cues. I had just built a routine around what time the clock said and what I knew was quote unquote correct. And so at the time when I was undiagnosed, I was like, I don't understand why it's so hard. Like how do you not eat all day? Because so much of it was built into my awareness of the clock that I was like, oh, it's noon. Or if I missed noon and I looked and it was 1, I'd be like, oh, shoot, I need to eat. But it wasn't necessarily, oh, shoot, I'm hungry. It was, oh, shoot, the clock says that I should have eaten food. But the disconnect from your own body, I think, is a really common thing that happens. And I'm not entirely sure why it happens on like a brain level. But something about that hyperfocus, man, sometimes it's really hard to remember that you have a body and that it needs things. Or it can feel really overwhelming that like you have to actually take care of your body. It feels like a lot of steps sometimes to get your body into homeostasis again.
Yes. And, this is something that we obviously are taught and have modeled for us and is not generally something that we've had cultural awareness of. And so I think, if we were all raised in the ideal environments, which don't exist really, right? We know that. We would really be able to have systems adequately address, oh, you have alexithymia. You're going to have more difficulty being able to tell how you feel. Here are the things that we practice doing, and here's how we identify. Here's how we do a check-in, and here's the actual feeling that you will feel if your bladder is full. We don't really do that, right? Because in kind of that neurotypical expectation, you're just supposed to already somehow know that, and that's really not there for everybody. So I do think it's an element of kind of being able to restructure and reparent yourself in that way, that if you had been able to be diagnosed then, if you had, your current adult self available to you, then how would you have most benefited from that? In what ways would you have structured your day? In what ways would you have helped your child, yourself when you were little, be able to check in and think, what do I actually want to do right now? What would feel good to me to do right now?
Yes.
And knowing that that's not something that is going to be bad.
I think that's really lovely. Kay, we are just about out of time. Thank you for being willing to extend the episode with me. I'm glad we were able to talk about it in a little more depth. Just as an outro, I guess, is there anything in particular that you would like creative people to know when it comes to the intersection of creativity and mental health?
I think it would be self-compassion. We really just create so many expectations for ourselves and really simplify things way too much. It's just this feeling of like, well, I want to do it, so I should be able to do it. So what's wrong with me for not being able to do it? And I think, again, kind of going back to that lack of control that we experience, that just sometimes being in our human avatar forms, there are many things that we cannot control. And it is normal to go through seasons and cycles of change, and times where you're productive, and times where you need rest, and times where you'll want to do something, and times where you don't. And there is room to be curious and figure out, okay, I do not feel like I want to do this today. It sounds like the absolute worst, even though I had planned on it last night. And instead of immediately going into a self-punishment cycle, to really be curious about it and say, that was not what I was expecting. Why might that make sense that I don't want to do it right now? And sometimes that curiosity can allow us to make maybe those sensory adjustments or to create a new thing that will fit so we can still accomplish that, or to just feel more okay with, okay, I'm just not going to do it right now. And that doesn't have to mean something less about me as a person, or that I'm, disappointing everyone or something.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap this up. The idea that we can be humans living on on a wavelength. We're allowed to not be the same from day to day. And that's okay. That's okay. Okay. This was absolutely lovely. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
This has been Rough Drafts Welcome.
Thank you so much for listening.
Got any questions? We would love to hear them. Got a complaint? We'll hear it too.
Yep. Leave us a 5-star review. Pretty please, and thank you. And if you want to book with Salt and Sage Books or learn anything else about what we do, or if you want to work with us or take our courses or blah, 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 you can find us at www.saltandsagebooks.com, and we're all over social media too.
We sure are.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.